So everybody, thank you for joining. So today the speakers are going to be Jane Wood from the Good Hay Guide, which is a FIPL funded project looking at horse health and the nutritional values of hay, and she'll go into that a little bit more when I hand over to her. Then there's me, Joseph Haywood. I'm the grassland officer for Nidderdale National Landscape. I work with landowners, land managers, and community groups to help them manage their grasslands better for nature. And so the schedule for today, we're in the intro now. In a few minutes, I'm going to pass over to Jane to talk about horse health, and she's going to talk for 25 minutes. Pass over back to me to go into detail a little bit more about grassland management, what's a species-rich grassland and why they're so important. And at the end, there's going to be 10 minutes for a Q&A. So if you've got any questions, if you could just please put them in the chat. If you agree with that comment that somebody else has put, you can like that. And then I'm going to choose regularly asked questions to pass on to either myself or Jane at the end. So yeah, just put your questions in the chat, because I don't think I'm going to be able to look at virtually raised hands. Right, so I'm going to pass over to Jane. If you want to share your screen, Jane, and get it all kicked off, that'd be great.
Do you need to, sorry, my share screen isn't quite
lit
up.
I've not made you. Give me 1 second. I've made you a presenter now. God, we practice this so many times, and then when the moment comes, sorry. I've made you a presenter now.
Right, have you got me?
Yeah, just need to share your PowerPoint and we're good.
Right, is that through?
That's brilliant. Crack away.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you very much everyone for turning up today. So it's a big subject, and I'm going to be talking about horse health, grassland management, and hay is really my specialization. And that's because I applied for a grant through FIPL to test hay and to answer a big question that I developed in my mind. So this first slide shows 2 mares of mine, and they're on my mum's farm in the Cotswolds. And this is unimproved grassland, calcareous banks. And these 2 horses had some fairly serious health problems, digestive issues. So the coloured mare had fecal water syndrome, which is mucky hocks. She had ulcers and EMS. I had other horses on my property that had just endless digestive problems. And these horses improved dramatically within sort of 48 hours of being on this species-rich, unimproved land. And I wanted to find out why my land in North Yorkshire, which was in the middle of productive farming land, should be so different for my horses. So the answer came when I started looking at how farming has changed. So have you got the second slide up?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's working.
Yeah, great. Sorry, it's just so this top picture is what I would call a good old-fashioned hay meadow. I've chosen one, a hay meadow alongside woodland, because that shows how different hierarchies of vegetation contribute to really good soil biology. So you've got trees, shrubs, grasses, forbs, herbs, and the soil biology which happens in that area, as long as it's allowed to be undisturbed as much as possible, so not overly compacted by machinery or grazing. And then the grass has been allowed to grow throughout the season. It's just beginning to turn colour to slightly yellow, and it'll be just ready for mowing. So it will have started to put its sugars down into its roots, and it'll be very fibrous. So this would make a great hay for horses. in contrast to that, on the bottom, you've got sort of the way that modern grassland farming is going. And you're basically cutting the leaf very young, and you're cutting it as often as possible. So you might get a silage cut in May, and then you might get another cut July. You might even get a third silage cut later in the year. And the point is that that grass is going to be quite high in non-structural carbohydrates. So these are the sugars and starches which enable livestock to put on weight. And also, obviously, you've got a much higher yield. So you're going to be making more money off those crops than you would off the picture at the top. So just to take from that, there's going to be more of that high NSC hay around. So why is that a problem for horses? So we hear quite a lot about horses being hindgut fiber fermenters. They're not ruminants, they're monogastric. So that means that they have quite a low tolerance for those high sugar energy feeds that you get in the short, rapid growing grasses. And you can see here, this is again unimproved grassland. Joseph will cover this type of grassland as well. And you can see that the horses, although they've got access to little bits of short, fast growing grass, they're moving on to the woodier, more fibrous materials, the gorse, heather, and it's the movement of the herd moving through those ranges that allow the digestive system to cope with these kind of woody, fibrous diets. So that's a good situation for a horse. That's a good sort of diet, and they'll be doing well on that. And importantly, as the year cycles, they lose weight and they go through a period of deficiency, and then they're ready to regain the weight and regain the nutrients again when you get the flush coming into spring. So they don't, importantly, maintain the same weight throughout the year. And this is what we've started wanting of our horses, that they look really good all the way through the year. They don't lose weight. And this could be part of the picture of why we're getting these metabolic problems. The other really important part of the picture is that obviously we're enclosing them and restricting the amount of grazing that they have. And we've kind of made this work for us, this situation here. We have the horse on the left is it's eaten off all the grass pretty much in its enclosure, and it's obviously getting a little bit overweight, and that seems like quite a happy position for it, because it won't be able to put any weight on with nothing to eat, grazing so close to the ground. But the problem is what it is eating is just the non-structural carbohydrates, the high sugar leaf. And what it's not getting enough of is fiber. So you see the sort of texture of the muscle there on the horse. It's quite fluidy. Personally, I would say that horse probably had equine metabolic syndrome. It would be typical of that situation, of it being on that short sugary grass, and not having good gut health. So the other problem with that is that grazing so close to the soil, you're getting a parasite problem, and parasites are becoming more and more difficult to deal with because of wormer resistance. So you've got a fairly unsustainable situation there. Contrast with the horse on the right, which is probably a feral horse. And again, you know, it has access to small bits of green grass there, but it's moved on and it's nibbling gorse tips, which are very high in minerals. And that's obviously going to slow it down. So it's not going to be gobbling material like that. It's going to be eating it quite slowly. Research coming out nowadays would suggest that horses on this kind of diet would have a very healthy gut bacteria population, and this will help it keep a robust metabolism. And then another thing to point out before I move on is that equestrian land accounts for about 5% of land use across the UK. So it's a considerable amount of land which is being quite often managed in the same way as that picture on the left, which is, in effect, it's that farming situation almost to the extreme, where the grass is just constantly bitten off, stunting the roots and limiting its ability to recover. So we get on to, if we can't increase the acreage for our horses, what can we do? So there are quite a few people who are beginning to have a lot of success with track systems, and basically any system where you can fence off the majority of your land so that you can rest it and it can recover. So the rest is the most important thing. And this horse, although it's confined to the edges, it's going to have to move quite a lot because you can place its hay strategically, and it also has access to these hedgerows, which are going to be very important for mineral availability, particularly coming into spring and summer. And also the sort of woody material, which is quite important for them to browse on. On the right, we have more of a European kind of situation. This is quite common. I think this may be Hungary. So the Slavic countries, you see this way of keeping horses quite a lot, where they're on an entirely hay diet over the winter to save the land. The land is not intensively farmed, and so the kind of hay you'd be getting off it is a good long stem species rich hay, and this would be quite a good situation for a horse here. So just to talk a little bit about how I do things. So this is someone who I buy hay off, and we're just having a look at his grassland. This is early on, and his hay crop is quite thin, but it's very, very fibrous, and it has a lot of forbs in it, so it's actually quite high in protein, and it's just a really good mix of nutrients for my horses. I tend to, what I'm describing is a completely organic system. Fertilizers are not a good idea because you're trying to lower the fertility of your soils so that these kind of plants can outcompete the strong, productive grasses. Again, the rules of don't overgraze, don't have stock on the land when it's wet, avoid compaction as much as possible, and plant hedgerows and trees because of that good soil soil biology that you can encourage. And the biggest one, I think, is reconsider how many horses the land can support. So I think what we need to do is we have to become very fussy about our land and less fussy about our horses. So our decision making is geared towards preserving the quality of the land always, and those decisions tend to work in favor of the horse, so we don't need to worry quite so much about the decisions we're making for them. So unsuitable grassland of the sort that I've started out with can very easily overload horses nutritionally, but so also can modern hays. So this is where my research and my testing came into the picture. I had experience of all of these problems, which come from overloading horses with sugars and starches. So laminitis, we're all familiar with. Gastric ulcers, obviously, are very common in the racing world. That's often compounded by the fact that they require quite large amounts of processed high NSC, non-structural carbohydrate feeds. And the problem with their system having to deal with that is they can develop these ulcers, and then that will actually stop them wanting to eat up their fiber. So they can end up unintentionally deprived of fiber just because it's just not very comfortable for them to eat it with ulcers going on. And then obesity is the thing that sort of overshadows all of this, the fact that quite a lot of us don't work our horses as much, or don't have the opportunity possibly to work our horses as much as we used to. And whilst that situation is okay for the horse, if it's combined with an oversupply of nutrients, you end up with a real battle on your hands to keep them at a healthy weight. And the real shame about this is that spending money on vets, and all three of these conditions can be very expensive to medicate and to manage. You could be spending that money on your land. You could be spending it on fencing, on planting, and it's a shame. So just to come to the research that I did, this was testing over 100 hays in Nidderdale, and I've grouped them into colours just purely on the basis of the sugars and starches. So obviously there are a lot of different aspects to hay and feeding hay, but if we just look at the sugar content, the sugar and starch content, which seems to be where we first start running into trouble with this oversupply of nutrients. The Laminitis Trust would suggest that if you have a horse with laminitis or EMS, you should try and keep your sugars and starches to under 10%. And you can see from this little study here that there's a very small amount of hay which is actually under 10%. And this is from my observations rather than anything I've found in a textbook. So I found that under 17%, a horse that wasn't in a huge amount of work, which was in reasonable health, was fine, could probably tolerate that. That was absolutely fine. But still, it's just quite a small section of this graph that comes under that level of sugar. By far the largest section, half of it, tested between 17 and 20%. And whilst this is okay to feed a healthy horse in a decent level of work, it does require, if you're feeding hay in this range, it does require good observation and understanding of when you might be getting symptoms coming from an overload of sugars. So, for example, if a horse is tripping or a little bit pottery in front or stopping at fences or all of these things, if you're feeding hay in this area, I think you need to just ask yourself, is it the hay? And again, if I haven't said it enough times, there's an awful lot of that and not very much of what I consider to be safe hay. And then these pink areas, pink and deep red, these are great livestock hays. And I'm sure a lot of racing yards feed hay at this level. Personally, I just think it's risky. If you're feeding a bucket feed on top of that, some of these hays would mean that your horses are getting up to 3 kilos of non-structural fibre a day. And I think that's a lot for any horse, even if it's going up the gallops 3 times a week or whatever. So, what I'm saying is we're not reinventing the wheel with species-rich hay. This is just how we used to make hay. And I would hazard a statement that we used to not have these problems when we fed single cut hay, cut once it had grown to maturity. Didn't used to have the same amount of problems as we do now, because we're making hay from improved pastures. And so all I'm suggesting is that we make attempts to recover some of what we've lost. So we have the high fibre correlating with low sugar from traditionally managed meadows. We have a large amount of plant diversity, and the mental stimulation that comes from horses that are specialist foragers, finding their way through different smells and tastes and textures. And then another thing that's worth mentioning is when you've been restoring meadows, when you're into your sort of 5 to 10 years restoration, you'll start getting some really nice plant species like, I mean, knapweed probably happens a bit earlier, but plantain, bird's foot trefoil, betony, and a lot of these plants are seen as ingredients in equine supplements. So they'll be used for insulin regulation and anti-inflammatories. You know, they're potentially useful plant compounds. So the main thing we need to be doing is thinking long term. So thinking into 2 growing seasons ahead, 3 growing seasons ahead, not thinking about where can I put my horses next year. And this is not just for people who would be happy to turn their horses out on moorland. I know a lot of people obviously have high standards about the quality of footing for their horses and the type of pastures that they're going out on, but a lot of major breeding operations, particularly in Ireland, like Coolmore and Kildangan stud, are beginning to look very seriously about how to improve their soils for the breeding stock. So they're thinking about their foals, gut biomes, and how that affects competition outcomes. So it's a bigger subject than just leisure horses, and I'm really hoping that it can start to get a bit of oxygen into the discussion. And then just this slightly sad way to end is, this is a leaflet that my mum had from ICI, which was a chemical firm in the the leaflet is from the 1980s. And this shows all the meadow species, grass species, that they recommend you eradicate with their herbicides. And they're exactly the same species that Joseph is now trying to get established back in our meadows in Nidderdale. So it's quite sad, but there's a lot of useful work to be done. And I'll hand back to you now, Joseph. I hope you do feel free to ask questions, any questions. And if there are any potential collaborators out there, just it's a big subject and it needs more people working on it. So I would love to hear from you. And thank you very much for listening.
Oh, thank you, Jane. That was brilliant. And we've had plenty of questions come through. So I'm firing loads over to you in the Q&A at the end. I just want to say that as I've recorded it and I haven't made you a organizer, Jane, your camera's been turned off. So just to let you know, Nobody, I don't think anybody knows what you look like. So you're a mystery. You're a mystery still.
That's okay.
We'll have to put a good photo of you on the email. Right, I'm just going to share my screen now and crack on with the grassland management side of stuff. Can you see my screen, Jane?
I can.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Yeah, I just say thank you again, Jane. That was really, really interesting. And we've had loads, and it's been a lot of food for thought, and we've got plenty of questions to come through. Okay, so yeah, as I said earlier, my name is Joseph Haywood. I'm the Grassland Conservation Officer for Nidderdale National Landscape. And today we're going to be learning about species-rich grassland management and what makes a grassland healthy. So, what are species-rich grasslands? Why are they really important, not just for horse health, but for the environment and the ecosystem services they provide to us humans? What are the threats to their existence and how we can restore them? Finally, I'm going to tell you how myself and the team at Nidderdale National Landscape can help restore your grasslands if you're within the Nidderdale National Landscape boundary. So what are species-rich grasslands? Well, as the name suggests, they've got a high plant diversity, but that doesn't just mean it has to be jam-packed full of wildflowers. Grasses, sedges and rushes are also a really important component of grasslands. We usually say for a grassland to be maybe a priority grassland, there's around about 30% wildflowers or more. And when we're looking for certain grasses, we don't really want ryegrass or white clover, which are usually remnants or relics of past seeding. So they're kind of agricultural cultivars. We're looking for more native grasses like crested dog's tail or sweet vernal grass. Species-rich grasslands usually have low soil nutrient levels. Having low soil nutrient levels, low soil fertility, allows more species to coexist next to one another. In contrast, if you have a high nutrient level soils, species that are competitively adapted, they've evolved to access nutrients really well. That's their strategy. They're going to take over and dominate the sward. Whereas if you've got lower soil nutrient levels, that allows less competitive species, but they might be designed to deal with really cold temperatures or really high temperatures. That gives them a foothold and allows them to persist. So low soil nutrient levels are really important. They're left to grow uninterrupted during the main growing season, or if they are managed during that main growing season, which is kind of spring all the way up to midsummer, so April to July. If they are managed, they're managed with a very light touch approach. So if we go for a meadow, for example, that's left to produce a hay crop, and it's going to have a single hay crop, and it's left to grow from April through to the end of July. But you might have an extensive pasture land up on moorland fringes, and it might be there's no boundary walls, it's just one big open area. If you lightly graze that with a low stocking density, you can have really species-rich pastures that are grazed through the summer. But it's just about the intensity of the grazing. With all that diversity of plant life, and they've also allowed to grow tall, the soil structure and the microorganisms that live in the soil are also really, really healthy. If you've got a taller plant, usually the roots are deeper through, creating a nice, friable, crumbly texture. It's not compact. And that friable, crumbly texture allows the soil to be aerated. And once you get in aeration, so oxygen down in there, that allows for healthy soil microorganisms to persist. If it's stagnant and compact and anaerobic, so there's no oxygen, you get bacteria that produce methane and other smelly compounds that aren't so good for above ground and below ground health. And they can be managed in different ways. As I said, a species-rich grassland doesn't need to be a meadow. James mentioned a lot about meadows today, but you can have your horse paddocks where they're grazing could be a species-rich pasture, only managed by grazing. Bring your attention to that bottom box. So species-rich meadows cover 1% of the UK's land area, and that's a statistic by plant life. Now, I'd like to think with the work that we're all doing through the national parks and national landscapes, we're actually increasing that now, but it's scary to think only a small percentage of our land cover is that. And if we get everybody in the horse community on board, we could get that to 6%. So we've got different types of grassland. We've got lowland and upland hay meadows. You can see it's jam-packed full of life there, loads of different colours and different structures, and you get an annual hay crop. And the lowland and the upland is slightly different plant assemblages. Rush pastures, they're wet underfoot, squelchy, comprise of a lot of rush. You've got shorter, tightly grazed areas, longer tussocky areas, and they're really important for wading birds. It's not quite rush pasture, but it's purple moorgrass or Molinia. So you go down like Exmoor and Devon, those extensive areas of coolm grassland, what they're described as they're managed by wild ponies. Not so much in Nidderdale, but you definitely get loads in the Yorkshire Dales, is calcareous grassland. So that's formed on a bedrock of limestone. So it's got a high pH, it's more alkaline. And these are some of the most species-rich grasslands you can get on the planet. So calcareous grasslands really support high diversity. You can probably notice that you're going to have some rocks jutting out from them. If they're grey or white exposed rocks, you might have a calcareous grassland. And finally, you've got acidic grasslands. They're more prevalent within Nidderdale, and they formed, instead of on a bedrock of limestone, it's a bedrock of gritstone or sandstone. So they've got a lower pH and they're slightly more acidic, and they'll have a different plant assemblage to the calcareous ones. There are other types of grassland out there as well, but that's just a flavour of the ones you'll find in Nidderdale. So why are species-rich grasslands important? They can sequester way more CO2 into their roots and underground compared with improved grasslands, and that really helps combat the climate emergency by reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, aiding to global warming. Because you've got a greater diversity of plants and deeper roots, healthier soils, that allows more decomposition and carbon to be stored in the soils. We've got deep roots, nice crumbly, friable, loose soil structure. Well, that's really, really good for allowing water to infiltrate through the soil as opposed to along the top of the soil. And that's helping reduce flood risks further down the catchment in urban areas, for example. So it really improves water infiltration. And a lot of funding coming from the government to conservation organisations over the past few years have been really focused on improving water infiltration in grasslands. So that water's being absorbed and percolating through the soil instead of across the top of your land. And that's reducing the amount of soil erosion that ends up into watercourses. So as the water hits the surface and floats and rushes off an unhealthy grassland surface, that takes small soil particles with it, deposits that in watercourses, and river gravels, for example, can get sedimented up. And that ultimately impacts the reproduction rates of species such as trouts and salmon. So how you manage grasslands can actually impact fish in the rivers. So it's all connected. By virtue of having a greater diversity of plants, you can provide feeding and nesting habitats for a greater diversity of other organisms. Some species, such as the common blue butterfly, that relies on legumes such as trefoils, bird's foot trefoil. That's its food plant as a caterpillar, and it only eats that. So if you had that in your meadow or in your grassland, you've got a higher chance of supporting that individual. Some are generalists and feed off lots of different plants. Others are quite specific, but just the greater diversity of plants you can get in your grassland, the greater number of other organisms you can support that way. And finally, probably what we don't think about it now, but they're really and culturally important, I believe we've lost our cultural link to grasslands, especially since the industrialization of agriculture. But once hay time, so taking your hay crop from like middle of July onwards, that was a really, really important time in the calendar year. You had celebrations, everybody used to gather together and work as one big unit. And if you look through lots of historical paintings, impressionist paintings, they're always depicting haytime scenes. So they were really embedded within the cultural psyche. And I think it's important to bring that back. So that's why they're important. But what are the threats to them? Initially, it's initially it's habitat fragmentation. So if you've got pockets of species-rich grassland dotted around the landscape, but they're isolated one another through silage fields that are mown multiple times a year, that's going to really impact the natural dispersal ability of certain plants to pass over that treacherous land in between the pockets of species-rich grassland. And if you lose a species in one field, you're going to really struggle to regain that species from another field through natural dispersion mechanisms. So that's why human hand is needed in this instance. So habitat fragmentation is a big threat. And you might hear a lot of things about habitat corridors and connectivity. So connecting these species-rich habitats back together again. It can just be inappropriate management. Maybe you've grazed it too hard. You changed livestock type and your land just didn't like it. Maybe you've grazed it the wrong time of year. Maybe during that main growing season from April through to July. Or you've just timed your hay cut. You've taken that a little bit earlier and you've stopped plants from flowering and setting seed so they can persist into the next year. So slight management changes can threaten a grassland that's species rich. And so it just takes careful consideration and observation so you know what you're doing. Neglect can lead to habitat succession. Maybe there is a field on a farm that's not grazed by the landowner, but a tenant farmer comes in, and they never seem to get to this corner field right at the back. Well, that's never been improved because they've never bothered to get the machinery over there. So it could be species rich, but their livestock never seem to get around that area either because it's a bit too far away from the main household. Well, those areas can be neglected, and if they're undergrazed, they can go through a process called succession, where they'll ultimately become woodland. So these species-rich grasslands can scrub up if not grazed sufficiently. Agricultural improvement. So things such as draining, adding fertilizers, reseeding. As I mentioned about soil fertility is really important. I think if you added fertilizer to a field that hadn't had fertilizer for many years, it could really alter the species composition. And it could, one season's work could actually cause 5 years of restoration to get it back to the original point. Finally, environmental impacts such as droughts and freak weather events that can negatively impact grasslands. So this is where there are threats and opportunities looking at the agricultural improvement and plant diversity relationship. So as agricultural improvement increases, usually plant diversity decreases. So in the bottom left, these are unimproved grasslands. These are the grasslands that are going to be producing hay or forage that's really beneficial for your horses. They've got high plant diversity, as you can see with the green bar at the top, and the agricultural improvement is low with the black bar at the bottom there. Now, as a farmer, you might be getting environmental land management payments for this. So you're actually getting, maybe SFI or countryside stewardship, higher tier, you're getting paid to manage those grasslands. And that's really great. Where they cross over, so where agricultural improvement is midway, plant diversity is midway, we're classing these as semi-improved. And I think probably a lot of horse paddocks are in this category. And I certainly work and aim for looking for land that is semi-improved. Then you've got improved fields. That's where agricultural improvement's high and plant diversity is low. The farmer will probably be getting several silage cuts off that field, and as therefore it's a high productivity, and that's the way they're making money off that field, and that's great for them. But these people in the middle, the semi-improved, this is where conversion and neglect occurs, because the farmer or the landowner isn't getting payments for managing it as species rich, nor are they getting a really high turnover and productivity from that field. And that's where they're either going to forget about it and it's going to scrub up, or they think, you know what, I'm going to improve that field. But this is where restoration opportunities lie as well. I don't necessarily need to work on the species-rich, unimproved areas. We can help protect them and continue the management as it is, because it's obviously working. But I can't really get a bang for a buck and restore them. But these semi-improved areas, that's what I'm looking for. That's where the opportunities lie. So how do we restore a grassland? Well, initially you can do it with seed additions. So I want to identify a species poor grassland with the suitable soil chemistry. It's got low soil chemistry, it's got low soil fertility, but the species on top aren't super diverse. And as I say here, these horse paddocks may be ideal situations for these. You might have not had it ploughed or really heavily fertilized, because you're probably picking up the poo quite a lot off the paddock, but it may have been reseeded in the past, so the diversity is not showing, reflecting what the fertility is below ground. So we've identified an area I want to restore. So I'm going to take and harvest seed from local suitable species-rich donors. We've got a list of species-rich donors that currently exist, and we harvest seed from them. We've prepared the ground at the receptor site, mowing the vegetation and using a harrow, spring tine or chain harrow to create about 50% bare ground. Then we can go and sow the seed that we've harvested on all the bare areas equally across the field. And it's important to roll the seed in or trample it with livestock. So you're making sure the seeds have contact with the ground. An opportunity for horse owners will be to, if you're buying in species-rich hay, there's going to be some seed left in that hay. If you spread the hay in different areas of your paddock to give the horse ability to move around and graze like a little bit more naturally, you're also actually potentially spreading seeds to those areas as well, and adding wildflower seed to your paddock just by grazing it, just by feeding the animals in a different way. You don't just have to add seed though. You can alter the grazing regime, as I said, reduce the number of livestock you've got on the area, reduce the number of horses you've got on the area, or just graze outside the main growing season. If somebody mentioned cross grazing and things like that, you might want to split a paddock up into 4 and move the horse every few days between each paddock. That will just be given a little bit of rest to help improve the grassland in each one of those sections. So just slightly altering the grazing regime can help restore it. Reduce your cutting frequency and change the timing. If you've got a meadow, an annual hay cut is sufficient, and you want to do it outside of the main growing season. Mid-July onwards is what we usually say. It's really important to reduce your nutrients input. So stop spreading fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer now. Farmyard manure, it's got to go somewhere, but just trying to minimize the amounts you put on is important. Reducing soil compaction. So if you've got vehicles, try and stick to designated routes so you're not driving all over the field all year round. Stick to tracks. And livestock or horses, if there's a particularly wet patch, prevent your animals from moving around in that area too much, because if it's wet, you can poach it and you can actually compact it a bit quicker. And so how can Nidderdale National Landscape help? Well, over the past 15 years, we've been doing meadow restoration and creation projects all over Nidderdale. And in 2025 alone, we're able to restore around about 40 hectares of meadows. So what's on offer to you? If you own or manage land that's within the Nidderdale National Landscape boundary, I can conduct soil sampling to see if the soil facility is correct, do vegetation surveys. I can identify remnant pockets of really species-rich areas that we want to protect. I might identify that this area is not so species rich and we want to put some seeds here or change the grazing, or change the management. I can provide site-specific management advice to your location and your needs. It's all by a case-by-case basis. I manage all the contractors that are involved with harvesting seed, preparing the ground, sowing the seed. That's all managed in-house. And most crucially, I'll be able to provide ongoing support through your grassland restoration journey, as it's not just this initial step, it's ongoing management and observation. That's really important. And this is all for free. So I just want to stress, if you're in the Nidderdale National Landscape and you want to restore your grasslands, I can do all this for free. So get in touch. So yes, I've jumped the gun there. There's my email address and phone number, but I'm going to be sending a email round to all the attendees with links and information and useful information. So you'll get that if you don't get this right now. There's loads of resource sheets available on the Nidderdale National Landscape website. If you go onto the events page, and sorry, if you go and search grasslands in the top search bar, you'll be able to find a whole suite of guides for grassland management for different organisms, whether it's fungi, invertebrates, or birds of prey, for example. And finally, your feedback is key. So you'll receive an email. There'll be a feedback form on there. If you just give 5 minutes just to provide your feedback for the event, and there's these questions on there about what sorts of things you'd like, what sorts of webinars, information you'd like to learn about in the future. I really want it to be tailored to the audience. So yeah, it would be really important if you could, it'd be great if you could do that. And there's a link to signing up to our newsletter if you're interested in future webinars. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to open it up to questions. So let me just stop sharing. Jane, I've written a few questions down and I'm going to fire one your way. Well, yeah, so, well, Angela asked a question initially, sorry. What's the best way to change a field of ryegrass used for farming to hay meadow species appropriate for horses? I hope you've got a little bit more information from what I just said, but, you know, doing the soil testing is really important. You need to know the fertility of your soil. If the fertility is low, you can change the species composition above ground. But if it's got a high fertility, you really need to reduce the fertility in your field, whether that be by taking multiple hay silage cuts, removing the vegetation, and just driving that fertility down. That's really, really important. But if you live in Nidderdale, then you can get in touch with me. Jane, I've got a question for you. Which species are undesirable in a species-rich grassland and which are undesirable? So I guess that just focus on for horse health. What are desirable and what are actually the undesirable species?
Yes. I haven't muted myself, have I?
Now I can hear you.
No, great. I've actually kind of answered that question, but I mean, we could talk about that forever because that's what I'm thinking about most of the time. Because, you know, I would love to be linking up with conservation projects, and the main problem for a conservation project is that if you have someone who's saying, I don't want this species in there, I don't want that species, you can end up, you know, it's a fairly, the collaboration is over before it's even begun, you know. So one of the problem plants that I talk to people about a lot is, and I don't want to call it a problem plant because it's a fantastic one, but yellow rattle is something that we use an awful lot to just basically get a head start on knocking back those productive ryegrasses. And I have an awful lot of yellow rattle in the hay that I feed. The main objection is that the seeds are toxic. And obviously, so there's a balance in all of this. If a horse has a healthy metabolism and a healthy gut biome, it will be quite resistant to small amounts of noxious or toxins in its diet. And the other thing, when you're feeding species-rich hay, these things, they're not very palatable. They tend to fall to the bottom of the feeder. And I love yellow rattle seeds falling into the bottom of the feeder because I scoop it up and I mulch it onto my fields in the bare patches. And then I've had yellow rattle coming up the next year. So I'm a big fan of yellow rattle, but it's something that when I'm talking to horse people who are very concerned about, their horse, I mean, it's, if your horse is a little bit off color and you suspect the hay, the species-rich hay, not knowing exactly what's in it, is going to be something that can become a real focus of your attention. Whereas in fact, when I'm looking longer term and looking at horses with better gut biomes, more resilient gut biomes, they're dealing with these low toxin levels really well. So that, yeah, my answer isn't very clear, and I just concentrated on yellow rattle, and my answer to almost any other species would be quite different because it's such a big subject.
No, great answer.
Okay, that's an example. That's an example. Yeah. Looking at yellow rattle.
And Nigel just said that surprised me. Yellow rattle is toxic. Well, I think it's one horse owner it is, and another horse owner it isn't. It's really quite. It's really quite variable. Susan Baker's asked, "Is your offer dependent on size of site?" So that's to me. And no, I mean if it's a back garden, then that might be a little bit too small for me. But if you've got a field, then I've worked on acre fields all the way up to large multiple field projects. So no, it's not really dependent on size unless it's a back garden, really. Liz has asked, are there similar NNL services for soil sampling in the Derbyshire Dales? Well, we only work in the Nidderdale National Landscape, but I think if you contacted, maybe is it the Peak District National Park? I think that's what it is there. They might have a dedicated grassland officer that could provide those services, but I can't give you any more details than that. Apologies, Liz. I've got a question for you, Jane. It was, and you may have answered it, but what is your opinion on cross grazing?
Yeah, so it doesn't really make any, as long as you where do I start with that question? I'm cross grazing at the moment with some lambs, and I've made a bit of a mistake because we've suddenly had a load of rain and they're really beginning to paddle it in. And although they're only a small group of lambs, 14 lambs equate to 1.5 horses. So if you think you're trying to rest your land and you've just put 1.5 horses out on it, you're not. What I'm saying is cross grazing, fantastic. It's a really good thing to do because different species are choosing different kinds of plant, and so they're keeping the competition on a level playing field. So yes, whenever you have the opportunity, it's good to have a different species in to take off any excess growth that you've got. But it's quite easy to get it wrong, like I've just done by putting lambs on at the wrong time.
Yeah, I think potentially if you've got control of the other livestock you want to bring in the field, that's really helpful because you can check in the morning if it's okay. The evening you might have had a deluge and they're poaching the ground or they're eating a bit more than you thought, and then you have complete control to remove them.
Exactly,
so
yeah.
I think if you've got access to your own other livestock, that has been helpful. Vicky Thoughts asked, what is a reasonable amount of time to rest a field after a horse or horses have eaten it down? i.e., how long will it take to recover before we put them back in? So I suppose In terms of what you're wanting it to recover to, if you're wanting area of grassland to go from short sward to vegetatively growing till you've got like knapweed leaves and then a stem and a flower, you would need to rest that completely for months. So that might not work in your system because you maybe not have too much land. But if you can split or strip graze a field, and it's all giving it by eye, but potentially 3 days to a week, assess if the vegetation has grown back quite well. And if that's working for you, then stick with that. I don't think by just altering the grazing slightly without seed additions as well, your paddock's going to become species rich, but you can definitely improve that rooting depth of the plants, improving the water infiltration, and then if the soil microbiology is better, then the microbiology in the plants is going to be better as well. So I think it's just a case by case scenario, but just try it. And me and Jane were chatting, weren't we, about just take a meter long strip out the edge of your field and leave that and see how long it takes before it flowers and sets seed. Then you've got an idea, and maybe that's all you need to do to improve your paddock. Just 1 meter at a time. Doesn't need to be all out war from the beginning.
If I just add to that.
Yeah, of course.
One thing I didn't say in my talk, which I meant to say, is that you as a landowner is in the best position to make these decisions because you're there all the time and you're looking at what's happening. And so for me, so yeah, I mean, your situation might be quite a complicated one because you really do want to get your horses back on that grass, because obviously if you're feeding hay and you're feeding bucket feed, even if you've got enough hard standing for them to be moving about, you're worried about things like vitamin E. Are they getting enough vitamin E? Are their selenium levels dropping? All that difficulty that you get when they don't have availability to fresh forage. So that's a big load of questions that you have to consider. But I mean, always consider that the shorter the leaf is above the ground, the shorter the root is. And a field can take one grazing event where the grass is reduced sort of to I don't know, a couple of inches without affecting the roots. But if you then come back and give it another grazing event, that second event will then stunt the root. So the more successive hard grazing it has, the less the root is able to recover. So if you think you've just leveled it once and then you're able to rest it for a good amount of how long? I don't know. How long does it take it to grow 4 or 5 inches? If you took it up to 5 inches and then ate it off again, you would then have affected the root growth, and then you'd have to rest it longer in order to put the horses back.
Right. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. Well, we're just 1 minute past 8, so I think we'll call it there. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope you found it helpful. I will send an email out with all our contact details, a feedback form, and useful links for tips. Keep your ears pinned for future events on grassland management. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.